Will Ferrell is one of the biggest comedic actors of the early 2000s, but he also has a couple lead roles in more dramatic movies that are highly underrated. Most people have heard of this first one, Stranger Than Fiction. It's a beautiful film that covers heavier topics like how we grapple with our own mortality and what it means to truly live. Now, I will have spoilers for this first movie because a lot of people have seen it already. To start with, one scene really stands out to me. It's where Ferrell's character has one of those trademarked Will Ferrell meltdowns, and you know what I'm talking about if you've seen his other movies where he just completely loses it and it's usually hilarious, but in this context it's quite heavy. He just heard the voice of the narrator say that he's going to die soon, so he tears up his apartment trying to get the voice to talk with him, to elaborate, to say anything at all, but nothing he does works. The voice remains silent. And while we've seen this type of outburst a dozen times in Ferrell's comedies, this scene ends up being deeply moving and portrays the utter helplessness that so many of us feel in the face of tragedy or uncertainty. The way that the film is able to take something that's a joke in one context and make it tragic in a different context is brilliant. But I think what I found most impressive about Ferrell's performance is that he simply plays the role like it's supposed to be played. He doesn't draw attention to himself unless the script calls for it, and he doesn't inject his own personality or habits into every scene. And that may sound like a negative, but it really isn't. There are actors who basically play the same character in every movie because they bring so much of themselves to each role. And that can be great at times, but I often think it takes more skill to bring as little of yourself as possible, to become the role and the character, to become almost invisible. And Ferrell does it perfectly. He does a really good job of playing this down-to-earth type of role. There's something about his demeanor and expressions that make him a really believable and sympathetic, normal guy. And it's funny that I'm saying that about the actor who played the larger-than-life characters from Talladega Nights and Anchorman and Zoolander. He feels like a completely different actor here. But through this unassuming character, the movie tackles some big existential topics. It takes a while to get going, but I love the second half of the film, and the final 30 minutes contain such a layered exploration of how we grapple with ideas of meaning, mortality, and the overall quality of one's life and even death. And it all happened so quickly that I didn't even fully realize how layered it was until my most recent rewatch. Like towards the end of the film, the protagonist, Harold, is at first distraught at the prospect of dying, but then he reads the story, or should I say his story, from start to finish. And I think two things happen here. First of all, the obvious thing. He sees that his death will be a self-sacrificial one, a theme that deeply resonates with us as humans. Even the most widespread religion revolves around a story of self-sacrifice. But I think there's something else that happens. Notice that he reads his story from start to finish. He doesn't just skip to the ending. And the movie really dwells on the shots of him reading through the whole thing. And by the end, he's able to accept the story as it is and even asks that the story be completed. And this points to something deep in the human psyche, the importance of having a meaningful story for our lives. The meaning that Harold sees in his potential death is amplified because it's the perfect summation of his story as a whole. When we're able to contextualize our own hardship and sacrifice within a larger story and a narrative that resonates with us, we can endure and overcome so much more than we would otherwise. That's one reason why the decline of this overarching sense of direction and purpose in society is so pernicious. I mean, I could probably talk about this topic for an entire video. But after that, the author decides to have Harold survive in the story, and there's the obvious reason for that, but the one that she gives in the movie is something else. If there's someone willing to sacrifice himself for others, isn't that the kind of person you'd want to keep alive? I mean, after all, don't we all wish that there were more of these types of people in the world? And in the end, she ties it all up by saying that the wristwatch, an unassuming accessory that represents moments in time, that is what saved Harold's life. And this sort of represents the entire film. Like in the first half of the movie, he's unable to enjoy the ordinary moments of life that feel like mere accessories because it's all just routine. But when he finds out he's going to die, he decides to break free from all that, not by doing anything big, but by simply enjoying the small, mundane moments of life, like learning to play the guitar or having dinner with a friend. So the event where Harold's life is saved by this ordinary wristwatch is a metaphor for when Harold started to really live by enjoying the ordinary moments of life. And it's funny to think that at the center of all this is this guy. And overall, I think Ferrell's excellent in the movie. It's a star-studded cast, and he more than holds his own. I mean, there's Dustin Hoffman, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Emma Thompson, and Queen Latifah. And out of all of them, Ferrell was my second favorite actor. And he's only second because Emma Thompson was so damn good. She perfectly nailed the role of the neurotic artist who's brilliant and creative, but also sort of detached from reality, and all of her mannerisms were so spot on. Now, I'm also a quirky artist, so hopefully this doesn't come off as pejorative. I mean, I probably look like this when I'm working. Now, upon rewatch, the dialogue that was written for Queen Latifah and Maggie Gyllenhaal early on are pretty on the nose, almost cliche, but as the movie goes on, that gets toned down a lot. And I don't think Emma Thompson's character would work without Queen Latifah. She serves as a bit of an anchor for the author/narrator's eccentric personality, and the dialogue between them gives the audience context and explanations for her quirky behavior. And Gyllenhaal's character really grows on me as the movie goes on as well. Side note, I really like the design of her bakery and apartment, and I think they nailed both of those settings. They honestly still resemble the present-day progressive bohemian artsy aesthetic, and I just think it's interesting and funny that this particular vibe and aesthetic are kind of like timeless. And I do have to say, I think Dustin Hoffman's character is just okay. But I definitely see what they were going for. I know at least 4 people in academia who are just like him, like kind of in their own world, very bright and highly interested in their subject of expertise, but also not really realizing that not everyone understands their references or shares their perspective. Also kind of lacking in empathy and tact, but you know, in a naive way, not maliciously. So I think they did a good job writing his character, but it just wasn't a very likable archetype for me personally. Oh, and a random thing that I have to point out, the locations in this movie are beautiful. I mean, some of these shots are gorgeous. And also, the motion graphics on this aged very well. I mean, this looks like this was made a whole decade later, especially considering that this is what graphic design looked like the year this movie was made. Anyway, I really liked Stranger Than Fiction, but I might like this next movie even more. Everything Must Go. Now, I'm gonna try not to give away spoilers because I know a lot of people haven't watched the movie, but I'll give some context that you'd find out from the trailer or like the first 6 minutes of the film anyway. Also, if you want to watch it, it's currently free on YouTube, but of course that could change in the future. Now, this movie was hauntingly good. It left me with a similar feeling as the ending of The Wonder Years or Lost in Translation, and I know that's a high bar, but it left me with the same sense of bittersweet ambiguity, and it stayed in my mind for a long time. Now, it's important to know what you're getting yourself into when you watch this. This isn't a laugh-out-loud comedy or a movie with a substantial plot, and the main premise isn't very realistic even though the characters themselves are. It's an independent film, so it's going to be a little bit different. I actually liked it more the second time around because I didn't even have to think about the plot and I could just focus on the characters and interactions. I watched this for the first time a couple weeks ago and I'm on my second rewatch already. The premise of the film is actually very much in line with a comedy movie from the early 2000s. It starts off with Will Ferrell's character, Nick, getting fired from his job and returning home to find out that his wife has left him, thrown all of his things on the front yard and changed the locks. Nick is in recovery for his alcohol use, but he quickly relapses after all this. He also finds out that his wife has frozen their bank account, so he just decides to live on his front yard and work through all of his problems while drinking PBR. And again, this sounds a lot like the start of a comedy movie, but it immediately slams on the brakes and slows way down. And instead of getting stepbrothers, we get a beautiful, nuanced exploration of the heavier things in life that many of us deal with, much like Stranger Than Fiction. What I love most is that Nick, the protagonist, is deeply flawed, but that doesn't stop him from having a profound impact on the people around him in the film. In a time of black and white ideologies and snap moral judgments, I appreciate the nuance and complexity that exists in this movie, and Ferrell being the primary conduit for this nuance is both surprising and impressive. There isn't this big sappy redemption arc for the character like a Hallmark movie or something. His character grows throughout the movie in subtle ways, and his progression is seen through small pockets and vignettes and interactions. And he also has setbacks. Nothing is linear. Throughout the movie, it seems like certain characters have all but written him off, but there are these pockets of poignant, deeply human interactions that he has with the neighborhood kid Kenny, or with his new neighbor across the street, or with his friend from high school who's played by Laura Dern. And without spoiling the ending, there is a sense of emotional ambiguity and open-endedness throughout, and I think that's partially why I was so drawn to this film. I also feel like the casting of a familiar, likable actor to play the lead role was such a good decision. That sense of familiarity creates this sort of subconscious sympathy for the character, and it's easier to empathize with him when he's dealing with the fallout of his alcohol use, kind of like how it's easier to empathize with a friend than a total stranger. And Ferrell's acting is great in this film. Just like Stranger Than Fiction, it seems like he perfectly understands the role and simply does what it asks for. He said in an interview about this movie that he always tries to play everything as real as possible. Even in exaggerated roles, he imagines that the characters are really like that. And that comes through so well in this movie. Again, he just plays the role like it should be played. And just like in Stranger Than Fiction, his demeanor and presence feel super down to earth and genuine. Whereas with a lot of other actors, they just have too much star presence to ever feel like a normal guy. Oh, also speaking of casting, fun fact, the actor who plays Kenny is Biggie's son, you know, the Notorious B.I.G. And he's really, really good in this role. Anyway, on that note, thanks for watching. While a lot of comedic actors have taken on more serious roles, I think Ferrell's up there with the best of them and deserves a bit more recognition, so hopefully my little analysis has done these two films justice.